Good morning. Thank you all for being here this morning. I want to thank Kelly and Leonora for what they've done to put this conference together. I would thank Boyden and George O'Neill, without whom we couldn't do a lot of the things that we do here at the American Conservative. It's my privilege today to introduce Tim Carney as our next speaker. I met Tim back many years ago when we would do these happy hours for the very small number of conservatives in Washington, D.C. who opposed the Iraq War. These were secret events at this time, although I was working here and Tim was working for Bob Novak, so it was maybe a little less risky for us than it was for some of the other attendees. But if something had happened to the tune-in at that time, 90% of the anti-war conservatives in Washington would have vanished immediately. So it was really dangerous times. Tim is really a ideal person to be speaking to some of the issues that we're discussing today. There's really been very few other journalists, if any, that I can think of off the top of my head who've written so much about crony capitalism and the issues of the sort of dirty alliance that often happens between business and government, even in areas where things are being sold to you as existing for some humanitarian purpose. They're often boosting and bolstering the profit margins of some corporation, and even ostensibly anti-business defenders of the little guy in politics that don't often want you to know that. And of course, Tim, who's the commentary editor of the Washington Examiner and a fellow at AEI, has a new book out where he's talked about some of the communities, Alienated America. I got to get the title in. It's a book where he talks about some of the communities that are really affected by the opioid crisis, really where there's not the sense of community and cohesion that there once was, and what the effect that has had on our politics. So Tim has really focused a lot of his journalism on two of the topics that are really central to what we're going to discuss today. Another unique thing about Tim is he is a member of the small list of nice people who has succeeded in Washington, D.C., a very difficult town for that sort of thing to happen in. So I won't embarrass him any further, and I'd like to turn this over to Tim. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Kelly and Boyden and the American Conservative. Thank everyone here for coming today. Sometimes I'm a nice guy, but what I'm not is a positive guy. I'm a journalist, so I focus on the negative. And as Jim suggested, I focus on crony capitalism and the collapse of American community. And to some extent, what we're talking about today is an intersection of those two things. But as a political journalist, I'll start with politics. When Donald Trump entered the presidential race in 2015, he said a lot of things in that opening press conference he had in Trump Tower. The most important one, he said, was not about Mexicans being rapists or anything like that. The most important thing he said was, quote, "The American dream is dead." The American dream is dead. A politician going up there and just flatly declaring that was completely out of the blue. It seemed absolutely bizarre to me. But as I went around to Trump rallies around the country and found people who had never voted before standing for 4 hours outside a rally, whether it was Rock Hill, North Carolina, or out in Monessen, Pennsylvania, what these people saw was finally somebody sees the world the way we do. The American dream is dead. So where did this idea come from? There are some purely economic explanations, but I don't think that carries the day. You can look in a place like Pittsburgh that suffered the death of the steel industry and the coal industry, and they're doing fine. You can, that there's something deeper going on. There's also an explanation that the people who were suffering in middle America, working class whites who ended up rallying to Trump, that they were simply deplorable. As one journalist vox-plained to us once, these people haven't been left behind, they've just chosen not to keep up. And then there was the explanation that actually the suffering of the working class was vastly overblown. There was no such suffering. It was just old white guys upset that they lost some of their privilege, and really things were just fine. One of the ways I do my reporting is what my colleagues call bar reporting. You go to a bar and you sit there and talk to people about politics. And over the years, you'd find some bars were better than others. You don't go to college bars because they don't vote. Hotel bars, everybody's from out of town. The sweet spot was what I called yuppie Irish pubs, because you had liberals, conservatives, centrists, men, women. Often the husbands and wives are voting for different parties. People are flipping, swing voters. It was great. One type of bar that I skipped after a lot of dry runs there in 02 and 04 were roadside country bars. Because you'd walk in, you'd ask them about politics, and they'd say, politics is a bunch of BS, I don't follow it. In 2016, you had to start going to these places because they'd say, politics is a bunch of BS, and that's why I'm supporting Donald Trump. So one such place in Fayette County, Pennsylvania, in a city called Uniontown, was a bar called Smitty's. And I walked in there, and the mood and the politics was what you'd expect. Dour attitudes about the direction of the country, 100% white, 100% voting for Donald Trump. If you asked about issues, they'd say guns, but when you pressed them on other things, they would talk about how everybody who could got out of Uniontown. And, well, the only way I'd stay is if I was rich enough to live in the mountains. Turns out falling water is right around the mountain bend there, but it's in a totally different world than what the world that the clientels at Smitty's were seeing. So I asked about the economy, and quickly, they talked about the coal, the steel. Quickly it turned to, oh, well, part of the problem is nobody works hard. Then it became complaining about the abuse of welfare benefits and food stamps and all that, and all these third-hand stories. The woman who bought a steak to feed her dog dinner using her food stamps, the guy who's using his unemployment benefits while really raking in millions as a drug dealer. And all these stories had a little bit of a racial undertone, but I also saw these guys complaining about welfare here. We're sitting at the bar at Smitty's at 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon. And, of course, I was sitting at a bar at 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon, but it was literally my job to do so. But so I asked one guy, I said, Dave, why don't you work? Back problems. He told me the whole history of his back surgery. I said, so all the jobs that are available around here are manual labor, and you can't do that. He said, no, there are office jobs, but, Tim, I can't sit at a desk for half an hour. I said, Dave, you've been sitting at this bar for about an hour and a half. And that's when he looked at me. He said, well, today I'm numb because my son died this morning. So the numbers, the facts, the statistics I had known in studying Fayette County and Uniontown before going there were now looking me in the face. And the explanations that this was a purely economic problem looked empty. The fact that this was an imaginary problem, that argument infuriated me. What we were facing here was an epidemic. I mean, Fayette County is 50% higher overdose rate than the rest of Pennsylvania, which is twice the rest of the country. And you guys know the numbers. The drug overdose deaths, fewer than 17,000 in the U.S. in 1999, above 70,000 in 2017. That quadrupling has happened among opioids specifically and among many sorts of drugs. The top two causes of these drug overdose deaths are fentanyl and prescription opioids. So both prescription drugs. Cocaine is on the rise too, but those two are still the top. The rise is starkest among men. And more Americans died of drug overdoses than from traffic fatalities or guns last year. American lifespans are shortening. Imagine that. Imagine 20 years ago somebody telling us, oh yeah, lifespans are going to start shortening a little bit into the 21st century. Mortality is highest in places, David Autor, the economist, showed, where men have lost low-skilled jobs. Factories have shut down. And it's not just deaths. We all remember the drug overdose stories. If you go from Uniontown up the river to Pittsburgh, and then it becomes the Ohio, and you go downriver in the Ohio River, you end up in East Liverpool, Ohio, where you might remember the 50-year-old grandmother and her boyfriend overdosing in the car and the police finding the toddler sitting in the back seat. And that became a real image of what's going on. That was what first grabbed my attention to this. And it's part of what I wrote about in Alienated America, the causes of this. It's a sense of pointlessness among unemployed men, largely, a lack of connection among communities and neighbors. Back in Smitty's, Dave had earlier told me that he keeps a gun next to his bed because he doesn't trust his neighbors. Uniontown, which used to be this proud steel town. And I would talk to guys who used to play on the varsity football team and how proud they were of them. Now you keep a gun next to your bed because you don't trust your neighbors. The bartender said, "Oh, I don't trust any of mine. The one above me is a dealer and the one below me is one of the customers." One couple told me that dropping their child off at the school bus, they saw drug needles there. And at first I thought about how sad it was to have the danger of the needles where your kids are getting on the school bus, and then I thought about how they ended up there. This wasn't a regular bus stop. This was a school bus stop. So again, we're talking about the parents dropping their children off, and they were probably the ones who left the needles there. So one journalist in West Virginia used the term social vacancy to describe the root cause, which is to say people who don't see a purpose in their life, they turn to these drugs. This is, I think, what explains the supply side. But then there's also the story, that's what explains the demand side. There's also the story of the supply side. So my other beat has been lobbying. And a general rule here in Washington is that what Big Pharma wants, Big Pharma gets. And Jim was referring to how long he and I have been around Washington. I remember the most outrageous floor situation in the House of Representatives was the passage of the bill to expand Medicare Part D to cover prescription drugs. This was a bill written by Big Pharma and supported by the big insurers. The difference was the Democrats had a bill that was supported by Big Pharma, but not really supported by the big insurers. That's the two difference between the two big parties. But they held open the vote for hours. There was literally members of Congress being offered checks for their son's election campaign, and then the checks being torn up if the guy wouldn't come over and vote. It was an incredibly corrupt passage of a bill to expand federal subsidies for prescription drugs. Big Pharma wins because Big Pharma always wins. Passage of Obamacare. No way that bill would have passed without the support of the drug industry. You had the drug industry rallying early on to get it, pledging millions of dollars to support the Democratic senators who were endangering their jobs in order to pass this bill. The Democratic House members who did lose their jobs in order to pass this bill landed jobs as lobbyists for the drug industry as well as other industries. So names like Bart Stupak, Earl Pomeroy, they were supposedly casualties of passing Obamacare. Nancy Pelosi somehow strong-armed them into voting against their constituents. Well, it's not hard to guess to see when you look at how many of those landed jobs in Big Pharma. In the first quarter of this year, the drug industry, according to the Center for Responsive Politics, has spent $86 million on lobbying, more than twice the next industry. Since 1999, it's $4.1 billion. Again, no industry spends even close to the amount on lobbying as the drug industry spends. Again, Center for Responsive Politics numbers. The defense industry, $1.1 billion. So that's 1/4 of the drug industry. Wall Street, 1.6, less than half. This is in the period that includes the passage of Dodd-Frank and the Wall Street bailouts. They spent less than half of the drug industry. Even the oil and gas industry, the dreaded oil and gas industry, less than half of, about half, $2.1 billion of the drug industry. Most recently, there was a bill called the Marino Bill by its sponsor, Tom Marino. The Drug Enforcement Act was the name of it. And one of the things it did was prevent the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, from doing the sort of enforcement activities they said they needed to do on the question of opioids, to crack down on the illegitimate distribution, sale, and prescription of opioids and of fentanyl. One of the main lobbyists lobbying on it was a man named Lyndon Barber. Lyndon Barber had been a top lawyer at the Drug Enforcement Agency from 2006 to 2011. This is the way Washington works. Our regulators cash out and become lobbyists. He was a chief counsel at the DEA and associate chief counsel at the DEA and a regional counsel, became the chief regulatory counsel at Cardinal Health, one of the major distributors of this drug. And according to one official in the Justice Department who invested them, quote, he wrote the Marino Bill. You become a regulator, you cash out to the regulated, you write the legislation, you hand it to the congressman who then passed the bill. In 2014, just one more story on how Washington works. I got an email from an old friend who ran in Republican circles. He had worked for the GOP and other things. His email address, though, now was pharma.com. I thought that was a pretty impressive email address. That was Purdue Pharmaceuticals. I didn't know much about them at the time, but he was pitching me a story. And it was complaining about some of the regulatory actions going on in Washington. And the expert he cited was from the U.S. Pain Foundation. Now, again, this is how Washington works. And now I'm an editor of an opinion page, and so you deal with op-eds coming in. But I've also covered lobbying. And there's an old term by an old economist, Bruce Yandel, which is Baptists and bootleggers. And the idea is a story is a bootlegger who wants to sell liquor illegally, worries that a county might no longer be a dry county, and then he won't be able to sell there because legitimate liquor stores will open up. So this bootlegger finds a politician, funds him, and says, you got to keep Gwinnett County a dry county. And so that politician with that money gets up on stage and brings up on with him the Baptist preacher who's going to explain exactly why we need to stay a dry county to keep the devil's brew out of the county. So the people on the stage selling the thing as in the public interest are the cover story. Even if they believe it, they're the cover story for the moneyed interest behind them. Government action, whether it's a government intervention or government or Congress keeping Drug Enforcement Agency from doing its job, there's almost always somebody getting rich behind it. For instance, there was a campaign against high fructose corn syrup recently being done by Citizens for Health was the name of the organization. And I called them and I said, your campaign against high fructose corn syrup, is that funded by the sugar industry? And he said, yes, it is. Citizens for Health. And then you guys might remember the governor of Texas mandated vaccinations, HPV vaccination, and it was something like Texans for Healthy Young Women, which was funded entirely by Merck, the manufacturer of this. So if you see an organization called something like Citizens for Americans Being Happy and Good, ask who's funded, ask who the funding is behind it. So U.S. Opioid makers made millions and millions of dollars over the years to some of these groups. Purdue Pharma, over $4 million, according to a federal study put out by Claire McCaskill's office. Insys Therapeutics, a fentanyl maker, $3 million. The U.S. Pain Foundation received $2.9 million. The other groups that were getting this money, American Academy of Integrative Pain Management, American Academy of Pain Medicine, American Pain Society, all getting $1 million, $2 million from these groups. Again, I believe that the people at these organizations, at these nonprofits, care about Americans who are struggling with chronic pain. This is, the debilitating. You can't be a grandmother. You can't be a father. You can't do your job with this pain. And I believe that the people at these nonprofits cared about it. But the policies that end up getting advanced are getting advanced because the money is coming from behind it. So this is how Washington works. This one is an interesting story because a lot of what I will work on has specifically to do with government intervention driving the problem. Here, there is government intervention, which we should talk about in the panel. Medicaid, funding about 100% of this, has created a very handy way for people to get the drugs into the counties where they end up causing these deaths and where the black market then takes over. Black market relies on Medicaid, which is to say it relies on federal subsidies for this program. But a big part of this story is the Drug Enforcement Agency not enforcing. So a big part of this fits into the standard story that the media will tell, which is a lack of government action. I don't spend as much time on that story because, again, the Washington Post and New York Times will write every possible story about what the government didn't do. But that is a large part of the story here. But the reason, one thing to keep in mind, why does Pharma spend so much on lobbying? In part because their entire business model always depends on government intervention. It depends on these government-granted monopolies. So you wouldn't have a lot of this innovation if it weren't for government-granted monopolies, right? These drug makers wouldn't make these drugs if they didn't have a chance to do so. But it also relies on government spending through Medicare, Part D, through Medicaid, as we mentioned, So this is an industry that, for better and for worse, is inextricably tied up with government. And now it's an industry that we see is behind the worst social trends here in America. So I think it's absolutely incredible that American Conservative has brought us all here to discover it, because it is really to discuss it, because a cross-ideological, cross-partisan discussion on a crucial issue like today doesn't happen every day. So it's good that it's happening today, right here. Thank you.
Are you available for a few questions?
So yeah, so I guess before we jump to the discussion, so signal me when we have to take to the seat. So any questions from...
Any questions? I'll come over to you with the...
There's a microphone that can come to you.
Okay, I have this one right here.
Thank you very much. I'm Mahin Khatami, a senior medical scientist, cancer researcher. I think the problem that you mentioned is very, very true throughout, and the medical establishment has created a very powerful controlling over public health that I believe the opium problem is a very small part of what is going on for the abuse of public trust and funding, because 90% of the cancer drugs fail the patient, they die, but they are milking their assets through the insurance or personal. I have written about this. My 4th book came out last year after my retirement from NIH, and I was a faculty at the University of Pennsylvania. So I believe that we have to pay more attention of who is in charge of public project and why we are not allowing competent professionals to get into the decision making, because there is profit for the medical system to keep competent professional outside, and they are making intellectual decisions that are wrong, and we call it medical scientific Ponzi schemes.
So thank you. There's a lot of, it's such a kludgy system between regulations, between deference to sort of medical practice, between the way the patents work, and that what you end up with is, but it's also really difficult that sometimes you want people to have access to drugs that aren't proven magical cures because maybe they're better than what you want, but then you see these companies sort of slightly one-upping, slightly reducing a side effect, and then that becomes the norm, and that's the name brand drug, and the generics that maybe have that one extra side effect can't even be prescribed in most cases. So it's what you get when you mix lots of government, lots of industry bureaucracy, but the profit motive stays the same, and then the inelastic demand of consumers. It's incredibly kludgy in a million ways, and I agree, yes.
Yeah, hi, Richard Parker, University of Connecticut Law School. First, I agree with virtually everything you said. I mean, it made a lot of sense, particularly your analysis of the despair of the white working class. In your analysis of crony capitalism, though, you use the term government as if it were sort of a monolithic whole. Congress, the bureaucracy, they're all just lumped in there, and they're all a bunch of crony capitalists, right? I don't quite buy that.
Sure.
And in particular, I don't buy the fact that there's no distinction between the DEA that are actually in their jobs as opposed to those people who have cashed out and left, and Congress. Congress can take money, and does take money, from Pharma for campaign contributions that, in a way that if any DEA person took money, they would go to jail, right? People, in my experience, in agencies are actually, very often, actually trying to do their job. You mentioned earlier that Congress had written a bill that stopped DEA
Yep.
from enforcing the way it wanted to. So I just wonder, don't you think you should distinguish between, what branch of government you're talking about? And it seems to me that what you've diagnosed is a real problem with Congress, and it's a real problem with campaign finance. And it's a problem that is driven very largely by Citizens United, which was a Supreme Court case that very, very controversially held that corporate money is speech and therefore it can't be limited. It seems to me that is that is the real source of the swamp, it seems to me.
So I agree that much of the bureaucracy, much of the executive branch consists of professionals who are doing everything they can to do their job well and thus address the problems of the country. I disagree that campaign finance is the root problem. I do still think the revolving door is the root problem, which is to say that the incentives of both lawmakers and policymakers and the enforcers, that their economic incentives, not everyone there, and not always on a conscious level, but their economic incentives is A, to play ball with industry, but B, and sometimes this is in conflict, to increase their own net worth, their own value to the market by further entwining government and private sector by both with more regulations and more subsidies. With more, here we're going to help you out, but here's some roadblocks. So what's going to make a guy more valuable to industry than crafting it? And again, you go back to Obamacare, you look at the people who were on the Hill in industry, come back when Obama wins. As Hill staff, they help write the bill. Then they go to the executive branch where they help implement the bill. And then when the lobbying firm hires them, they say, you need to have Liz Fowler or finance, you need to have Amy Friend as your lobbyist because she wrote this bill which increases the complexity of government and that sort of thing. So I will say that I think you're right to point to that money in politics, including campaign finance, has a corrupting influence, and the way we talk about Congress and the executive branch needs to be different. But the revolving door in the executive branch is an immense problem, and I think, in fact, and we don't have time for that here, but I think it's a bigger problem than campaign finance.
Hi, my name is Jackie Lee. I'm a reporter with Bloomberg Law. You mentioned Pharma's role in getting Medicare Part D passed and Obamacare. Pharma lobbied very hard to reverse the amount they would have to pay in the donut hole, raised from 50 to 70%. Chuck Grassley has mentioned that he wants Pharma to start picking up the tab in catastrophic insurance. The FDA is holding meetings about whether or not to take high-dose opioids off the market. I'm curious if you think right now we're having a turning point in terms of Pharma's influence over Congress, or if this is just kind of another blip and it's going to be same old in 5 years from now.
I think that you can see the fates of Purdue Pharma, Purdue not going well. I think that on the opioid front, the reputational harm done to the companies, the distributors, and the manufacturers has been immense, and it has swung around Congress's willingness to act. If you look, Clara McCaskill has not batted an eye about taking, or did not bat an eye about taking on the industry, and Republicans, I think Donald Trump's willingness to sort of talk about we're going to cut into your prices and lower your prices has sort of emboldened Republicans to also take on the drug industry. I wouldn't call it a turning point. Industry still spends twice as much as any other industry, and they still have lots of the former colleagues and former staffers of these congressmen and senators on hand as lobbyists. But right now, the industry is vulnerable. Their pleas, I don't think, are being heard as strongly on Capitol Hill, and the reputational damage done by a lot of the opioid crisis, as well as these other factors, has meant that both Republicans and Democrats are at least a little bit more likely to buck the drug industry today than they typically are. No, I don't think you'll have a permanent change. I think that this is a low tide of Pharma's influence. So if something's going to pass, it's going to pass in the short term. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. That was wonderful. I really appreciate it. Tim will be joining us for the panel. So we're going to just take maybe 2 minutes.